In this next fractal pattern, I want to explore chauvinism from the angle of masculine and feminine energy. And in the loosest sense of the word of yin and yang, or polarity, all exchange of energy breaks down into masculine or feminine. For example, to exchange a gift, someone has to give the gift, active, dynamic, masculine. Someone has to receive the gift, receptive, feminine. To have a conversation or an exchange of information, someone has to speak, assertive, masculine. Someone has to listen, receptive, feminine. In order to have a human experience, one must think, structure, masculine, and one must feel, respond, take an emotional reading, feminine. In the human experience, there's the structured outer representation of reality, masculine, and there's the inner reality, feminine. In the relationship with time, there is structured and planned time, masculine, and there is spontaneous time, feminine. In the allocation of priorities, there are human relationships and felt experience, feminine, and there is objective results and goals, masculine. And so if we go deeper, and I've certainly talked at great length on other video series about the nuances of masculine and feminine energy, what I want to explore here is the fractal nature of chauvinism, which is the overvaluing of masculine energy and the undervaluing of feminine energy. So if we look at an individual level, and the specific pattern that I'm looking at here is, just to digress a moment, is the irrational over-exaggeration and overvaluing of masculine energy and the irrational undervaluing of feminine energy. Because if you break the whole into two halves, masculine and feminine, the scientific assessment is that each half is equally required to complete the whole. The scientific assessment is also that the whole has a higher potential for synergy, for value, than either half alone. If you think of electricity, for example, and you ask a battery designer, is the negative pole on the battery more or less important than the positive pole of the battery? This is an absurd question to a battery designer, because you do not get electricity, the synergy of the positive and negative pole, without an equal amount of positive and negative pole. And so, if we understand that the science supports a position of equality in all polarities, as long as we step outside of the cult values of culture, we can then look at the imposition of cultural chauvinism in a number of different dimensions at different sizes and scale, because a fractal pattern is essentially the same pattern, just bigger or smaller or in different arenas. So on an individual level, one of the things that we do with chauvinism is we spend a great deal more time focusing on acquisition of money, acquisition of a car, acquisition of a house, expanding a house, getting another house. We spend an enormous amount of energy on acquisition to an irrational degree, while simultaneously ignoring the acquisition of technology, of habit and skills of dealing with inner space. And so, as a Westerner, trained in the cult of Western masculine chauvinistic thinking, if you have to decide between improving one's well-being by getting a second house or a third car on the one hand, with all of the energy that entails, because it takes the earning of, hundreds of thousands of dollars to acquire the second or third house, the 10, 20, 30, 50, $100,000 to buy the additional car, or it costs absolutely nothing to develop an inner state through meditation or through reading a book that is elevating thoughts and feelings. And so we see the significance that we place as individuals on acquiring things. Now, the other thing that I see as a contractor is that many of my clients have frayed marriages, struggling relationships to one degree or another. And yet, in deciding whether to spend money on a family vacation, which would be more experiential, or on spending more time together, or working longer hours and creating, for example, renovating a house or renovating a garden. A client is often quite comfortable dropping $30,000, $50,000, $150,000 just like that because everyone's doing it. While if you ask the same client to participate in inner development of a felt human state, the idea of spending even $1,000, 1/100th of the outer investment, does not click. Now, when we go to family, one of the areas we see the chauvinism playing out is the dominance of mass or top-down authority, focused power over decentralized power. The idea that the person who makes the most money, for example, will dictate what everyone else does. The idea that someone is valued based on their income. The idea that prestige, the amount of social ranking based on power or authority over other people, is valued more than the felt human experience. And if we look at history, history is the recording of dates more than it is the examination of the felt experience of people living in historical events. And so when we say history, what we're really practicing and remembering are dates. The Battle of Waterloo, the treaty with, to purchase California, the treaty to, ban slavery. We talk about occurrences by date, and we consider this to be a complete understanding of history. And yet, nobody is asked to read the diary of a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old child living through those events. And the gathering of emotional data to capture the felt human experience of all of these different events is rarely, if ever, recorded. The end of the war is recorded. The beginning of the war is recorded. and taught in history. The key moments of shipments of goods or movement of troops. But there is no recording in our culture's version of history of the level of terror, of the troops being shipped, of the level of shame, of the level of confusion. The emotional landscape of the human beings involved is viewed as secondary to the objective movement of bodies and material around the planet. If we look at data, similarly, we gather things like standardized test data or census data. But despite measuring, are you black or are you white, or is your income this or is it that, there is no question in census data. There is not a single question to report how you feel. And when we do ask Americans how we feel, it is, how do you feel about the economy? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the economy? And we record things such as spending. Data is skewed 95% to non-experiential dimensions. So the experiential dimension, the subjective felt emotional experience, is ultimately all you and I care about. If we're feeling great, or if we're feeling traumatized, that is ultimately all you and I care about as human beings. Because human beings identify primarily with their experiences. And all of this objective manipulation of cars and houses, etc., is intended, directly or indirectly, to boost the experience. And so it's remarkable that we don't actually measure the experience. When we look nationally at the relationship between government and people and government and other people, again, the feminine dimension is ignored. Whether it's the data of the GNP of a given country. I believe the country of Bhutan is the only country in the world that presently measures happiness, which is what we say, even in our own United States Constitution, the right to pursue happiness being a very essential right. We do not actually measure how happy people are. So what good is the right to pursue happiness if there are a majority of people that are unhappy? It's a right in potentia. On a national level, we do very little to facilitate and measure well-being. We have millions of American homeless as we speak, and it doesn't seem to be high on anyone's agenda. And even if housing them is high on the agenda, understanding how they feel as human beings doesn't show up on the radar at all. In personal relationships, long after the survival and security is tended to. I mean, one can travel the world through most of history and most of the planet today and find people surviving and secure in that survival for a few dollars a day. And yet, in Western countries, where someone might make $1 million a year, $750,000 a year, the emphasis in the relationship is that work automatically becomes first. Work is automatically elevated as an objective metric of production ahead of intimate relationships. One is in fact considered a bit of a loser for valuing feminine energy enough to truly prioritize the family. with the most precious resource of all, our time. In work, we have a concept called professionalism. And within the framework of professionalism, one of the primary tenets is not taking things personally and not bringing one's personal business into the professional relationship. In fact, the definition of a professional relationship is the sophistication with which an individual masks their feelings. Because feelings are the one thing that are banished from professional relationships at all levels, to the extent that we call it unprofessional to bring feminine energy into the place that we spend 80% of our discretionary time. In religion, there has been a very large push to move towards the objectification of sacred experience. Meaning every religion, be it Buddha, be it Christ, be it Muhammad, Moses, every religion, be it all of the different seekers and seers, began, even science began with a vision, a personal, meaningful experience in an individual that changed the individual's relationship with the outside world. So, in the case of science with René Descartes, he had a vision with an angel. And the angel, presumably feminine, the angel told René Descartes, a soldier, to go forth and master measurements and numbers and give birth to Cartesian thinking, the thinking of René Descartes. So Buddha has a vision. Christ has, an inner dialogue with something meaningful. And yet every religion that has crystallized around these unique individuals has moved to dogmatize and crystallize the religion into a single structure that is the structure, our structure with top-down control, and views as a threat living individuals who have deep inner truths different from the dogma that the church has created. And in other words, one could say that particularly monotheistic religions like Christianity that say there's only one God, and it's Jesus, and we're the only ones who know about him, and we're the only ones who know exactly how to be a Christian, and we're therefore the only ones that can give you a gate into heaven, and everyone else. So if you have a sacred vision from your feminine self, if you're the new Jesus who has a new vision, you are the enemy of organized religions, because your sacred spiritual experience, your spontaneity, your authenticity, your uniqueness is a direct threat to the stagnating rigidity of masculine dogma in the form of all organized religion. And it is no accident that there is not a single major religion today that has a woman or anything feminine as the highest pinnacle. In other words, when all religious dogma elevates, in the crudest sense, men as an expression of masculine energy above women, the entire paradigm is skewed. towards the masculine. The ultimate paradigm, the pinnacle, is set as singularly masculine, which a scientist will say is impossible. Because how can you have a singularly masculine ultimate, anything, if masculine is part of a larger whole that is equally feminine and masculine? Every man and every woman was equally created by a man and a woman, by a man inseminating a woman. Now, if anything, the biology suggests that the female is more important in that process in terms of the amount of work done to give birth to a child. And so, if there is, for example, if all of the men in human history that have elevated men above women would not and could not exist without a man and a woman, without a woman and a man, in equal parts, or many would argue, if anything, the insemination is the smaller part, then you don't get the opportunity for men to develop dogmatic ideas about male superiorities, such as Mr. Chauvin, the first chauvinist, a Frenchman. You don't get the opportunity for chauvinism without females giving birth to the chauvinistic men and women who propagate the dogma in contrast with science. And then you have science itself, which 95% of all science is directed in masculine domains. So you look at medicine, and every time I go to a hospital, my number one complaint is not feeling like a human being because my feminine side is not engaged. When I had a recent elbow operation, it went so far as my surgeon saying he would not perform the operation unless I agreed to have an opaque shield so that I could not see my doctor's face, so that I couldn't talk to him, and so that I couldn't see what was going on in my own body. And he is considered a great surgeon. He is considered a great surgeon while completely negating the feminine part of a healing experience. The personal relationship with another human being who is calling themselves a healer because they're healing the physical body while simultaneously insulting the feminine soul. I want nothing to do with that. I'm just interested in your bones. And certainly in a surgery, one could say, well, there is, if you have to, either have a broken bone for the rest of your life with a nice person, or, have a sociopath fix the bone, go with the sociopath fixing the bone and then spend time with your friends afterwards. But the interesting thing is the dogmatic irrationality with which medical science has gone out of its way to negate the feminine. This went so far in medical history to, the time of Louis Pasteur, talking about germ theory. You see, in chauvinism within science at the time, and this is the chauvinism and the irrationality of science, because you don't get science, certainly not as quickly and as formatively, without René Descartes. Now, René Descartes gets science from an angel. That's his story. Meaning, he was a soldier marching along, and an angel visits him in a vision. And out of that, Cartesian science is born. The dogmatic arrogance of the children of Cartesian logic is our materialistic science today, which says that if you don't see it, if you can't measure it and see it through the physical senses, as crude as they are, it doesn't exist. Which means that the angel didn't exist. Which means that René Descartes was insane. Which means that the founder of modern science in many ways is a lunatic. But that's glossed over. That's the irrationality of the dogma. When it comes to the obvious evidence that germs are killing people through unsterilized surgeries, by surgeons performing amputation after amputation before germs were discovered, and Louis Pasteur says you should wash your hands and sterilize your surgical saws before cutting off another person's leg. It will save their life. And he was laughed out of town. Why? Because the dogma of materialistic, chauvinistic science says that we can't see it, therefore it doesn't exist. Everything that exists has to be visible to our stupid eyes, said the chauvinistic surgeons of the time. And so thousands upon thousands of people were murdered by their doctors because the doctors couldn't see germs. And it wasn't until a microscope was invented, such that the arrogance of materialistic science could be satisfied, that people agreed to start washing hands and sterilizing instruments. In other words, they weren't looking at their own data, blinded by chauvinism. So, in every area, small or large, this bias against the feminine, against half of reality, exists. And it exists irrationally. It exists irrationally.